Welcome back to Philosophizing with a Hammer. This is the third episode of our series on existentialism, where we examine key literary works through the lens of Nietzsche's philosophy. In our previous episodes, we explored Crime and Punishment and Notes from Underground, diving deep into Dostoevsky's psychological landscapes and their existential underpinnings. And today we turn to another masterpiece by Dostoevsky, one of my favorites, The Brothers Karamazov. First, let's set the stage. So, The Brothers Karamazov, published in 1880, it is a complex novel that interweaves themes of faith, of doubt, morality, and freedom. And at its core are the lives of three brothers, Alyosha, Ivan, and Dmitri, each embodying a different aspect of human nature and philosophical inquiry. And there's also Smerdyakov, which is the illegitimate son who complicates the family dynamic even further. Once again, I apologize if I mispronounce any Russian names because I'm not familiar with Slavic languages. I do have some Slavic friends who told me that, hey, you mispronounced some of the names in the previous episode. Sorry, I apologize, I try my best, but let's focus on the content other than the pronunciation, I guess. So, from a Nietzschean perspective, the novel is a treasure, actually. It's a treasure trove of ideas that resonate with existentialist thought. And Dostoevsky examines the struggles of meaning, of freedom, and the consequences of living without a metaphysical framework. They are precisely the themes that Nietzsche grappled with in his works. And before we continue discussing the novel, I'd like to say a few words on the 19th century Russian social background that was definitely a major element in shaping Dostoevsky's works. So, when Dostoevsky wrote The Brothers Karamazov, which was roughly between 1879 and 1880, Russian society was undergoing a profound social and also intellectual transformation. This was a time of upheaval, marked by tensions between tradition and modernity, the rise of radical political ideologies, and so on. Therefore, it is safe to say that in order to proceed further with the novel's analysis, it is relevant that we explore a bit of the daily life in Russia during this period and the cultural context of nihilism that arose at the time. Now, imagine a vast empire where most people still lived in rural villages, bound to the rhythms of the land. Though serfdom had been abolished in 1861 already, but the peasants remained shackled in other ways, for example, by debt, by poverty, and by a deep dependence on traditional ways of life. The countryside was dotted with wooden churches. Their onion domes gleaming in the sunlight where villages sought solace in faith, let's say, and religion was not just a belief system. It was the thread that bound communities together. Yet, even as the Orthodox Church presided over their lives, the winds of doubt began to blow, and in the cities, these doubts turned into storms. Urban centers like Moscow, like St. Petersburg, were swelling with people pulled from the countryside by the promise of work in factories that belched smoke and into the sky. Life in these industrial cities was harsh. Overcrowded tenements, grueling work days, and a sense of alienation that gnawed at the soul. And amid the chaos, a new class of people was emerging. These were the thinkers, the writers, and also the dreamers, many of whom had turned away from the Orthodox faith that had sustained their ancestors. They devoured Western philosophy, ideas from thinkers like Nietzsche, like Hegel, like Schopenhauer, searching for answers in a world that seemed increasingly devoid of them. And this basically was the age of nihilism, an idea that took hold of the Russian imagination. To the nihilists, the old order, the Tsar, the church, the family, was nothing but a crumbling facade. They believed that life had no inherent meaning, that morality was a construct, that the reason and science were the only paths forward. For some, this philosophy was liberating, but for others, it was terrifying, as it should be. It led young men and women to renounce their families, their faith, and their traditions, seeking to build a new world on the ashes of the old. But what kind of world would that be? And Dostoevsky actually asked this question, and his answer was grim. He had seen the darker side of nihilism, not just as a theoretical idea, but as a lived reality. He saw how it could unravel the human spirit, leaving people untethered and adrift. In the Brothers Karamazov, he gave us Ivan, the intellectual consumed by his own ideas. Ivan's declaration, and I quote, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." End of quote. This is the cry of a generation that had lost its faith, but not its yearning for meaning. Through Ivan, Dostoevsky showed us the moral chaos that could follow when the foundations of belief are torn away. Yet nihilism was not just an intellectual exercise. It had real consequences. In the streets and in the salons of Russia, revolutionary fervor was building. And radical groups like Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will, sought to overthrow the autocracy, sometimes with bombs and assassinations. This was a time when idealistic young men and women believed they could remake society through sheer force of will, and when others recoiled in horror at the violence and destruction that often followed, they saw it as a chance. And Dostoevsky's world was one of stark contrasts. On one side, there was the tradition, which is the faith, the rituals, the community. And on the other, there was the chaos, the doubt, the alienation, and the search for something new. He saw both the beauty and the danger in each. And in the Karamazov family, he laid bare the struggles, let's say, of people caught between their past and their future, torn by the same questions that haunted Russia itself. It was a time when everything seemed to hang in the balance, when the old world was crumbling and no one knew what would replace it. Through his writing, Dostoevsky captured the heart of that moment, the fear and the hope, and also the possibility. And in doing so, he gave us not just a story of his time, but a story for all time, actually. One that still resonates in a world that often feels as fractured and uncertain as his own. Now, as we have understood what was life like roughly in 19th century Russia, it is safe to tackle the novel's main themes and philosophy. Brothers Karamazov centers on the, let's say, tumultuous lives of the Karamazov family. The debauched patriarch Fyodor Pavlovich and his three legitimate sons, Dmitri, sometimes also referred to as Mitya, Ivan, and Alexei, or Alyosha. Along with his illegitimate son, Smerdyakov, as we said earlier, each of them embodies a different philosophical ideals, and their interactions illuminate the tensions between spirituality and rationality, as well as hedonism, and the broader existential dilemmas that define humanity. Fyodor Pavlovich is a wealthy but morally bankrupt landowner who neglects his children after the deaths of their mothers. Dmitri, his elder son, inherits his father's sensuality and impulsiveness, but retains a sense of honor and guilt that sets him apart. Ivan, now, the second son, is a brooding intellectual who struggles with the questions of God and morality. His aesthetic view clashing with his underlying yearning for meaning. And Alyosha, the youngest, a gentle and devout novice monk, mentored by a wise and compassionate Elder Zosima. Elder Zosima's teachings on love and forgiveness deeply influence Alyosha. And Smerdyakov, Fyodor's illegitimate son and also a servant in the household, is a cynical and nihilistic figure who secretly harbors resentment toward the family. The novel begins with a family meeting intended to resolve a financial dispute between Fyodor and Dmitri over an inheritance. However, the meeting devolves into chaos, underscoring the animosity among the Karamazov, that is, the members of the family. And Dmitri accuses Fyodor of withholding his rightful share of the inheritance and competing with him for the affections of Grushenka, a beautiful and capricious woman. Dmitri is passionately in love with Grushenka, despite being engaged to the virtuous and loyal Katerina Ivanova. Fyodor, driven by lust, also pursues Grushenka, intensifying the familial conflict even more. Meanwhile, Smerdyakov's disdainful demeanor and subservience mask his growing nihilism and schemes. Now, amid these familial tensions, Dostoevsky delves deeply into philosophical and spiritual themes. Alyosha's faith is tested when elder Zosima dies, and his body begins to decay rapidly, disappointing those who hoped for a miraculous sign on his sanctity. This event shakes Alyosha's faith temporarily, but ultimately strengthens his commitment to love and humanity. Ivan, in contrast, articulates his rebellion against God during a pivotal conversation with Alyosha, rejecting the notion of a benevolent deity in light of the world's suffering. He narrates the parable of the Grand Inquisitor, in which Christ returns during the Spanish Inquisition but is condemned by the Church. The Inquisitor argues that humanity desires security and authority over the freedom Christ offers, presenting a scathing critique of institutional religion and human weakness. Dmitri, now, driven by jealousy and despair over Grushenka, becomes increasingly erratic. On the night Fyodor is murdered, Dmitri's frenzied behavior, roaming the town and squandering money and threatening violence, makes him the prime suspect. The investigation reveals that Fyodor was bludgeoned to death, and Dmitri's prior threats and financial motives appear damning. He is arrested and put on trial. However, it is eventually revealed that Smerdyakov, influenced by Ivan's philosophical musings, committed the murder. Smerdyakov confesses to Ivan before taking his own life, leaving Ivan consumed by guilt, descending into madness, haunted by his perceived complicity. The trial of Dmitri becomes a public spectacle, and reflecting societal biases and moral hypocrisy. Now, the prosecution paints him as a depraved and violent man, while the defense emphasizes his honor and love for Grushenka, arguing that the evidence against him are circumstantial. Despite the defense's compelling arguments, Dmitri is convicted and sentenced to exile in Siberia. Alyosha remains a source of support for his brother, offering spiritual guidance and hope for redemption. He also encourages Grushenka to seek a more virtuous path and helps Dmitri plan a possible escape to America. The novel concludes with a sense of cautious optimism, primarily through Alyosha's actions. He befriends a group of loyal children, offering a solace to a boy named Kolya and uniting the community in mourning the death of a sickly child, which is Alyosha. At its core, the Brothers Karamazov is a profound meditation on the human condition. It explores the tension between faith and doubt, the struggle for moral responsibility, and the dynamics of familial and societal conflict. Through its richly drawn characters and intricate narrative, the novel poses enduring questions about the existence of God, the nature of evil, and the potential for redemption. Dostoevsky's masterpiece actually ultimately affirms the possibility of spiritual renewal, urging readers to embrace love and forgiveness as the path to transcendence. One of the most interesting themes in the novel is light in the character of Ivan and his rebellion against God, a typical archetype of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. I recommend you checking out the episode on the death of God and on Zoroastrianism for more details. You can check them out to fully, have a core idea about the concept of Zoroastrianism and the death of God as far as Nietzsche is concerned. Now, back to Ivan, the intellectual of the family. His famous declaration in the chapter titled Rebellion is central to understanding his character and philosophical stance. He refuses to accept a world designed by God if that design includes the suffering of innocent children. Ivan's rebellion is not atheism in the traditional sense, but rather a moral rejection of the universe's divine order, an order that seems to him indifferent to or even complicit in human suffering. One of the most striking aspects of Ivan's arguments is his vivid imagery and emotional appeal. He recounts stories of children subjected to unimaginable cruelty and asks, here I quote, "What kind of God allows this?" You can see that his objection isn't merely theological, it is deeply personal. He cannot reconcile the idea of a loving, omnipotent deity with the existence of such horrors. In essence, Ivan is asking, can we morally accept a God who demands that kind of suffering as the price of redemption? Now, Nietzsche's concept of the death of God resonates strongly. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he wasn't merely speaking about the decline of religion's belief itself. He was highlighting the collapse of the moral and metaphysical structures built on the idea of God. For Nietzsche, this collapse creates a profound crisis. Without God, where do our values come from? In other words, do we really need a divine deity to tell us what to do and follow their orders because we are too stupid to differentiate between good and bad? Well, Ivan's rebellion is a direct engagement with this crisis. By rejecting God's moral frameworks, he finds himself in a moral and existential vacuum. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Ivan doesn't stop at rejecting God. He takes the next logical step and considers the implications. So if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. This famous line encapsulates the terrifying freedom of a godless universe. Without a divine arbiter, humans are left to determine right and wrong for themselves. Nietzsche saw this as an opportunity for the rise of the Übermensch, the overman. As you already know from previous episodes, the figure who embraces this freedom and creates their own values. However, Ivan fails to take this step. Instead of embracing the challenge of value creation, he becomes consumed by existential despair. The same trap that Schopenhauer and his followers fell into. Speaking from a Nietzschean point of view here, Ivan is haunted by the abyss left in the wake of God's death. This despair manifests as a kind of nihilistic paralysis, where the absence of objective meaning becomes a source of torment rather than liberation. And again, I always keep emphasizing on this idea because many people, I've known many people who thought that Nietzsche was a nihilist. Well, no, he is the complete opposite of nihilist. He basically argues that when God dies, when the values that once were created, that we were following and living by, die, you should not fall into nihilism. No, you should rise above it and move to the Übermensch. Nietzsche acknowledges that life is harsh, life is difficult, but he does not advocate for nihilism. On the other hand, he advocates for power, for the love of life, amor fati, as we have seen in the other previous episodes. And Ivan's torment is further complicated by his own internal contradictions. On one hand, he rejects God and divine justice, but on the other hand, he cannot entirely escape the moral framework he has rejected. Now, this tension is most evident in his relationship with his illegitimate half-brother Smerdyakov, who takes Ivan's philosophy to its grim conclusion by committing patricide. Ivan's ideas, stripped of the moral constraints he disavows, become a weapon in Smerdyakov's hands, forcing Ivan to confront the practical consequences of his rebellion. In the end, Ivan's story is a cautionary tale. Dostoevsky seems to suggest that rejecting God without offering a viable alternative leads to a spiritual and moral void. Nietzsche could agree on this point. But he would add that this void isn't a dead end, but a starting point. A chance to rise above nihilism and affirm life through the creation of new values. Ivan's tragedy lies in his inability to make this leap. Now, let's turn our attention to Dmitri, the eldest of the brothers. Dmitri is a man ruled by his passions, a character who burns with intensity in every aspect of his life. He loves fiercely and hates bitterly, and also pursues pleasure with reckless abandon. He is the epitome of the Dionysian spirit that Nietzsche discusses, a celebration of chaos, vitality, and the raw, untamed force of life. To understand Dmitri, imagine someone who feels everything at full volume. When he loves, it is overwhelming. When he is jealous, it's consuming. He is driven by desire and impulse, embodying a kind of vitality that is both magnetic and self-destructive. Dmitri doesn't just live, he explodes into existence. But this unrestrained Dionysian energy is both his strength and his downfall. Nietzsche admired the Dionysian force because it represents life in its most primal form, but he also believed it is needed to be that there is a balance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian, which is the force of order, reason, and discipline. Dmitri, however, lacks this balance, and his life spirals into chaos because his instincts are unchecked. His obsessive love for Grushenka and his rivalry with his father, over Grushenka led to catastrophic consequences, including violence, betrayal, and eventually his implication in the patricide. Yet, Dmitri isn't merely a figure of hedonism and destruction. Beneath his wild exterior lies a man capable of profound emotional depth. His moments of guilt and yearning for redemption shows that he is not entirely consumed by his impulses. Dmitri begins to grapple with his existential questions about freedom and responsibility, and for Nietzsche, true freedom comes from not from abandoning moral codes, but from transcending them, by creating one's own values and living authentically. Dmitri's journey hints at this possibility, though it remains incomplete. There is a particularly poignant scene when Dmitri reflects on his guilt and envisions a future where he might atone for his actions. This moment suggests the beginning of an existential awakening. Dmitri starts to see that his life, despite its chaos, has the potential for meaning, if only he can take responsibility for his choices. Dmitri's story, then, is not just a tale of excess and tragedy, but also of potential. He represents the struggle to embrace life's passions while facing the consequences of living without a balance. Nietzsche might argue that Dmitri, though flawed, embodies the raw material for greatness. The kind of intensity that, if tempered and directed, could lead to the creation of something extraordinary. And in the end, Dmitri's narratives lead us with questions. Can chaos ever be fully tamed? Can someone so consumed by passion find redemption? And what does it mean to live authentically in the face of one's deepest flaws? Through Dmitri, Dostoevsky invites us to wrestle with these questions, and through Nietzsche, we are reminded that even in the chaos of existence, there lies the potential for transformation. Finally, we come to Alyosha Karamazov, the youngest and most spiritual of the brothers. Alyosha stands in stark contrast to his brothers, where Ivan wrestles with the rebellion and despair, and Dmitri burns with unchecked passion. Alyosha here radiates compassion, faith, and a quiet strength that holds the family together. At the beginning of the novel, Alyosha is a devoted follower of Father Zosima, the wise and compassionate monk who preaches love, humility, and forgiveness. Alyosha's deep connection with Father Zosima positions him as a symbol of harmony and grace, an embodiment of what Nietzsche might call the Apollonian ideal. The Apollonian, as we said in Nietzsche's terms, represents the forces of structure and order and meaning, the qualities that provide balance to life's chaos. But Alyosha's spiritual journey is not without its trials. When Father Zosima dies, his body begins to decay, and this physical corruption becomes a public scandal. To many, it appears as a sign that Father Zosima was not a true holy man. This moment shakes Alyosha to his core. The man he revered, whose teachings guided his life, seems to be posthumously discredited. It is a test of faith, actually, a confrontation with the fragility and the imperfection of human existence. What is remarkable is how Alyosha responds to this challenge. Rather than falling into despair or losing faith entirely, he chooses to embrace life and humanity more deeply. He doesn't cling to an idealized, otherworldly vision of goodness, but finds meaning in the messy, imperfect reality of human relationships. This is where Alyosha's journey aligns with Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate. The amor fati for Nietzsche is the radical acceptance of life in all its forms, including its hardships, imperfections, and sufferings. And it is not about resigning oneself to fate, but about embracing it with love. Actually, finding joy and purpose in what is rather than yearning for what it could be. And Alyosha's response to Father Zosima's death exemplifies this philosophy. Instead of rejecting the world for failing to meet his ideals, he chooses to affirm it. He invests himself in love, community, and the people around him. Now, one of the most moving moments in Alyosha's journey occurs when, in the chapter called Cana of Galilee, here, Alyosha experiences a spiritual renewal not through abstract theology, but through the simple human act of sharing bread and wine with others. It is a profound affirmation of life and connection. Alyosha realizes that even in a world without divine guarantees, love can definitely create meaning, along with human solidarity. Alyosha's story isn't about escaping the pain and uncertainty of life, but about embracing it with open arms. In Nietzschean terms, he demonstrates the courage to say yes to life, even in the face of its darkest moments. He represents a different kind of strength. Not the fiery passion of Dmitri or the intellectual defiance of Ivan, but a quiet, steadfast resilience that refuses to give in to despair. Through Alyosha, Dostoevsky shows us that meaning can be found not in great gestures or ideological battles, but in small acts of kindness, in forgiveness, and in love. And through Nietzsche, we are reminded that such affirmations are not signs of weakness, but of profound strength, the strength to create meaning in a world that offers no guarantees. So as we reflect on Alyosha's journey, we are left with a powerful message. In a world of chaos and suffering, the path to meaning lies not in rejecting life, but in embracing it, flaws and all, with love, with compassion, and a deep sense of gratitude for the gift of existence itself. So, no discussion of the Brothers Karamazov would be complete without addressing one of its most famous and provocative sections, the Grand Inquisitor. This section recounted by Ivan in a story within the story, is a philosophical and theological masterpiece that criticizes institutional religion along with the tension between freedom and security. In Ivan's parable, Christ returns to earth during the height of the Spanish Inquisition. Instead of being celebrated, he is arrested and condemned by the Grand Inquisitor, which is a powerful cardinal who embodies the church's authority. And in their charged conversation, the Grand Inquisitor accuses Christ of burdening humanity with an unbearable gift, which is freedom. He argues that people do not want freedom as it comes with the heavy weight of choice and responsibility. Instead, they crave miracles and authority, something to provide certainty and relieve them of existential anxiety. The Grand Inquisitor's speech is chilling in its insight into human nature. He believes that by rejecting Christ's offer of freedom and instead promising people bread and guidance, the church has done humanity a favor. For him, control and security are more compassionate than the terror of freedom. Now, let's bring Nietzsche into this picture. For Nietzsche, freedom is the defining trait of the free spirit. He celebrated the individual who has the courage to reject dogma and take full responsibility for creating their own values. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for example, Nietzsche's overman, the Übermensch, rises above the herd mentality, embracing the uncertainty of life and along with strength and creativity. The Grand Inquisitor represents the exact opposite of Nietzsche's ideal. He embodies the life-denying force Nietzsche criticized, which is the institutions and ideologies that prioritize comfort. And the Inquisitor here sees humanity as a weak and incapable of bearing the burden of freedom. Nietzsche, however, believed this underestimation of humanity was part of the problem. By pandering the masses' desire for security, institutions like the church perpetuate a cycle of dependence and mediocrity. What makes Ivan's parable so fascinating is its complexity. The Grand Inquisitor is not a caricature of evil, but a deeply tragic figure. He genuinely believes he is helping humanity by sparing them the pain of freedom. His bleak vision of a humanity, one that prefers bread over self-determination, is a stark warning about the dangers of surrounding autonomy. And here's where Dostoevsky and Nietzsche converge in a surprising way. Despite their different views on faith, both insist on the necessity of individual freedom. Dostoevsky, through the lens of Christian existentialism, and Nietzsche, through his atheistic existentialism, both argue that to live authentically, one must confront life's uncertainties and take responsibility for one's choices. The Grand Inquisitor's vision is seductive as well, because it offers relief from existential dread. But as Nietzsche reminds us, this kind of relief comes at a cost, which is the suppression of the individual's potential. For Nietzsche, the greatest danger lies in allowing fear and complacency to rob us out of the chance to become something greater, to survive, to struggle, and eventually to create. You know the saying, what doesn't kill you make you stronger. And Ivan's parable challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Are we willing to bear the weight of freedom with all its uncertainty and responsibility? Or do we, like the masses in the Grand Inquisitor's vision, do we yearn for the comfort of authority and the illusion of certainty? In this sense, the Grand Inquisitor is not just a critique of religion itself, but a broader existential question about human nature. It forces us to confront our deepest fears and desires, pushing us to ask, what are we willing to sacrifice for freedom, and what does it mean to truly live? And through this parable, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche's issue is a shared challenge, which is to embrace the chaos and uncertainty of existence, not as a burden, but as the very essence of what it means to be human. When examining the brothers Karamazov through a Nietzschean lens, we can draw profound insights into the existential struggles that Nietzsche so eloquently explored throughout his works, such as Zarathustra and the Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche's philosophy, particularly his ideas about the death of God, as well as the search for meaning in a chaotic world, they find an uncanny resonance with the novel's structure and characters. The Karamazov brothers, Dmitry, Ivan, and Alyosha, they embody these struggles in their own distinct ways, and their respective journeys present a rich canvas for understanding Nietzsche's concept of the human condition. Nietzsche's philosophy, particularly his ideas about the death of God, the search for meaning, the tension between passion and order, they all find an uncanny resonance with the novel's structure and characters. The brothers Karamazov, the three of them, they embody the struggles in their own distinct ways, and their respective journeys present a rich canvas for understanding Nietzsche's conception of the human condition. Nietzsche's idea of the death of God is central to understanding the existential crisis that each of the Karamazov brothers face. The death of God is not merely the loss of religious faith, but the collapse of the metaphysical order that gave us meaning and moral direction. For Nietzsche, this absence creates a vacuum, a space where the individual must confront the meaninglessness of existence and the profound responsibility to create meaning for themselves. This is where Dostoevsky's characters intersect with Nietzschean thought. We can look at Ivan as an archetype of the Zarathustrian image as far as the death of God is concerned. Ivan represents Nietzsche's Übermensch in the sense that he is fully aware of the consequences of the death of God and feels the weight of existential freedom. He is a rationalist, he's an intellectual, and someone who wrestles with the suffering of the world, especially the cruelty inflicted upon innocent children, which he argues makes the existence of a benevolent God logically impossible. This crisis is best illustrated in his famous declaration that he will return the ticket to God, refusing to accept a world ruled by an indifferent or unjust deity. This rejection of divine order is Nietzschean in its nihilism. Because Ivan, like Nietzsche's last man, is repelled by the concept of transcendent moral framework and is left grappling with the abyss of meaninglessness. His refusal to reconcile with a world governed by a cruel God leaves him stranded in the void, an intellectual exile who ultimately succumbs to madness. Nietzsche might see Ivan's intellectual stance as an initial confrontation with the abyss, but his inability to transcend this nihilism and embrace the potential for creating meaning reveals the limitations of pure reason in confronting existential reality. Now, we can look at Dmitri as someone who represents the passionate, impulsive side of the human response to existential freedom. While Ivan seeks to intellectualize the absence of God, Dmitri plunges into a life of hedonism and excess, embracing his desires without restraint. His reckless pursuit of pleasure, epitomized with his obsession with Grushenka and his tendency to overindulge in alcohol and violence, mirrors Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. Dimitri's search for meaning is not philosophical like Ivan, but let's say emotional. It was marked by chaos and remorse. However, his tragic flaw lies in his failure to integrate this passion with a sense of responsibility or higher purpose. His destructive behavior, while emblematic of Nietzsche's critique of asceticism and the repression of life's pleasures, ultimately leads to self-destruction because his inability to reconcile his inner contradictions, like his longing for redemption and his pursuit of vengeance and his moments of genuine spiritual insights, They expose the dangers of living solely for the moment without a higher moral or spiritual framework. In a Nietzschean context, Dmitri can be seen as an individual who is caught in the turmoil of existence but has not yet fully embraced the potential for self overcoming and the affirmation of life. Speaking of which, the affirmation of life, we can look at Alyosha, who represents the possibility of life affirmation in a world stripped of absolute truths. His faith in God, initially shaken by the death of Elder Zosima and the decay of his body, embodies the struggle for spiritual authenticity in a time of doubt. Unlike Ivan, who recoils from a universal devoid of a moral certainty, Alyosha here seeks to affirm life through love, and particularly through his interactions with the children in the novel. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate, is closely mirrored in Alyosha's quiet acceptance, let's say, of the suffering in the world. Not as a divine test, but as an intrinsic part of the human experience. Alyosha's path is not one of passive submission to a higher power. Rather, it is an active choice to love and to find meaning in the relationships and responsibilities he assumes. His spiritual journey reflects Nietzsche's ideas that individuals must create their own values in the face of a world without inherent meaning. And Alyosha's response to the world and its suffering is not intellectualization or reckless abandonment, but it is an attempt to weave together a life that is both meaningful and rooted in a deep sense of connection to others. We can look at also the concept of the abyss in the novel and its confrontation, because Nietzsche's philosophy challenges individuals to confront the abyss of meaninglessness, to face the terrifying freedom that comes with the death of God, and to respond by creating one's own values. The Brothers Karamazov as a novel presents each of the brothers as embodying different responses to this challenge, reflecting Nietzsche's view that the human condition is inherently filled with struggle, but that it is through struggle itself that individuals can transcend their limitations and affirm life. While Ivan's nihilism and along with Dimitri's chaos each represent a form of failure to overcome the abyss, Alyosha's path suggests that meaning and authenticity can be found through love and commitment to others. In a Nietzschean sense, the Brothers Karamazov is simply a reflection of existentialist thought, but a vivid call to live courageously and authentically. The novel does not offer easy answers to the fundamental questions of human existence, but it invites us to wrestle with the meaninglessness of the world and, in doing so, to create meaning from within ourselves. As Nietzsche would say, we must affirm life even in its suffering and embrace the responsibility of crafting our own destiny. Dostoevsky, through his richly developed characters and complex moral dilemmas, he urges readers not to shy away from the struggle, but to confront it with the full force of their freedom. In this sense, the novel can be seen as both philosophical inquiry and a spiritual manifesto, a call to transcend nihilism and affirm life through the conscious creation of meaning. It offers a timeless lessons that remain deeply relevant in today's 21st century society, a world marked by rapid technological change, political instability, and a pervasive sense of moral and spiritual crisis. Dostoevsky's exploration of human nature and faith and morality, search for meaning, they deeply resonate with the contemporary concerns about the loss of moral grounding, of existential angst, as Heidegger would call it, and the struggle for personal and collective authenticity. The novel serves as both a mirror to the personal dilemmas we face and a guide to how we might navigate the complexities of modern life with wisdom and compassion. So, to wrap it up, the Brothers Karamazov deal with a lot of main themes and topics we're going to start by, summing them up one by one as we have been discussing so far. So first we have the crisis of faith and the search for meaning. In an age where religious institutions are often viewed with skepticism and where many experience a sense of spiritual disillusionment, the Brothers Karamazov as a novel invites readers to confront the crisis of faith that has plagued humanity for centuries. Ivan's rebellion against the idea of a benevolent God in the face of human suffering speaks directly to the contemporary and existential dilemmas. Today, as individuals increasingly question traditional religious narratives, the novel's exploration of the death of God and the meaning of life becomes an inquiry into how we cope with a world where absolute truths are often elusive or denied. The novel asks us, how do we find meaning in a world that often seems indifferent or even hostile to our ideas? In the 21st century, with the rise of secularism and the decline of religious authority, individuals are forced to ask and seek meaning in new ways, whether through humanism, personal achievement, relationships, or creativity. The Brothers Karamazov emphasizes that while the death of God may create an existential vacuum, it also offers an opportunity to create meaning through our choices, especially our relationship with others. Alyosha Karamazov, as the character who retains faith, illustrates the idea of spirituality that is not about rigid adherence to dogma, but about the lived experience of love and the search for authenticity. In today's world, where people often grapple with religious doubt and the disengagement, Alyosha's path serves as a reminder that faith, in whatever form it takes, we're not only talking about religious faith, it can still provide a foundation for meaning in life. This theme resonates in our society where, despite growing secularism, many individuals turn to spiritual practices outside traditional religious institutions, seeking a personal, authentic connection to something greater than themselves. The novel also talks about the moral implications of free will and responsibility. One of the most profound themes in the novel, actually. In a time where modernity has brought with it both unprecedented freedom and uncertainty, the novel challenges us to reconsider the ethical implications of our choices. Ivan's philosophical rejection of God and Dimitri's passionate pursuit of pleasure expose the potential dangers of extreme freedom without moral compass. In our era, the idea of individual freedom is often celebrated, particularly in the context of personal rights and autonomy. However, the novel reminds us that with freedom comes the burden of responsibility. We cannot merely act according to our own desires or impulses without considering the consequences of these actions, particularly in relation to others. The novel encourages us to understand that our choices are not isolated, but have wider implications for the community and society. And finally, the novel teaches us about how to embrace the complexity and ambiguity of life. We live in an age, basically, polarized ideologies. They often present clear-cut answers to complex issues. Dostoevsky's novel refuses to offer simple resolutions and answers to these questions. The characters in the Brothers Karamazov embody a range of contradictions and complexities, and the novel challenges us to accept this messiness as a part of the human experience. It calls on us to approach life with humility, recognizing that answers to the fundamental questions of existence are not easy or fixed, but must be wrestled with and continually re-examined. In today's world where many seek certainty in the face of complexity, the Brothers Karamazov encourages us to hold space for ambiguity. The question is to question actually our assumptions and to engage with the moral and philosophical challenges of our time without expecting clear solutions. The novel's portrayal of human nature is as complex and deeply flawed. It invites us to be more compassionate with ourselves and others in the face of our collective struggles. The Brothers Karamazov offers a profound and timeless exploration of the human condition that speaks directly to the challenges of the 21st century. In a world marked by moral uncertainty, spiritual disillusionment, political unrest, Dostoevsky's novel invites us to confront our own existential dilemmas, to wrestle with the meaning of freedom and responsibility, and to ask and to seek, actually, authenticity in our relationship and our actions. Through its complex characters and rich philosophical insights, the novel provides valuable lessons about the importance of love, compassion, and moral accountability, and as well as the search for meaning in a world that often seems devoid of it. Ultimately, the Brothers Karamazov teaches us that while life may be filled with suffering and uncertainty, it is through our choices, our connections with others, and our commitment to creating meaning that we can affirm life and find redemption. Thank you all for joining me on this journey into the Brothers Karamazov. Let me know if you'd still like to hear more about Dostoevsky. Perhaps we could explore another work of his next time before we move to another existential writer. Until then, keep philosophizing. Signing off.